on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and that they have nurtured and cared for this land for time immemorial. And this part of our task today is to honor that. So my name is Mary, and I'm joined by others who are members of the IPA, the Environment Team, the Truth and Reconciliation Team. So we've all come together on this issue. We were inspired by Bruce McIvor's talk and his book, Standoff, to educate ourselves about the doctrine of discovery and Terra Nullius. We discovered that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, called all religious denominations and faith groups to repudiate the doctrine of discovery and Terra Nullius. So this was call to action number 49. So we learned that the UUA did repudiate the doctrine of discovery in 2012, and many Canadian churches also repudiated the doctrine, including the Anglican Church and the Catholic bishops. So we wondered if UCV would also join in denouncing this doctrine. So our goal today is to explore this idea with you. So we have our topics for discussion. So first, a brief history of the doctrine of discovery and Terra Nullius, which will be presented by Goethe. And then we'll explore how it impacts Indigenous folks today, which Elizabeth will be talking about. And then what it would mean to us and Indigenous peoples if these doctrines were repudiated. And Cecilia will be talking about that. And then finally, we'll open up the floor for questions and comments. So very interested in your feedback. So we'll be recording it on flip charts and also recording comments and questions from the Zoom participants. So, yes. So we might not get through everything today, but we envision that this is only the first of several forums. And we have to acknowledge that we're not experts in this matter. It's so you may have questions that we can't answer, but we'll make a note, we'll do some research and get back to you. So, well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Goethe.
Good morning. I hope I'm unmuted for the Zoom. My name is Goethe, and I want to tell you about the origins of the doctrine of discovery. Bruce McIvor defines it for us in this slide. The doctrine of discovery is a legal principle that European countries extinguished indigenous sovereignty and acquired the underlying title to indigenous peoples' lands upon discovering them. The doctrine of discovery is inspired by racist 15th century papal bulls dividing up uncivilized indigenous lands for European powers. It became a legal principle through United States Supreme Court decisions of the 1820s and 30s. That's very early in the life of the young republic. The Marshall decisions. It made its way into Canadian law in the 1880s through the St. Catharines Milling decision. So this so-called doctrine, as he says, is still being used to underpin Canadian legal decisions. But how appropriate is it to our understanding of the world today? It was initially drawn up in a set of papal bulls or decrees issued by the popes in the 1400s and 1500s. Those decrees threw a false veil of righteousness over what were really mercantile and military adventures by burgeoning European nations in search of gold, spices, and other possible plunder, ventures that turned into armed invasions with looting and seizure of lands by European conquistadors, traders, soldiers, and immigrants as the colonization of the Americas ensued. That process, as we now know, had genocidal consequences. The Europeans were entering a terrain with many varied cultures, some urban, some agricultural, some living from the land, all interconnected by flourishing trade networks. Then, in the 100 years from European arrival, the indigenous population was reduced from 100 million to 10 million people. The quotation that you saw when you entered, if you had time to read it, gives us a taste of these papal bulls. Through his edict, Pontifex Romanus, in 1455, Pope Nicholas V authorized King Alfonso of Portugal to conquer the west coast of Africa and parts beyond. I quote, "To invade, search out, and capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit." That wording, all Saracens and pagans whatsoever and other enemies of Christ, signals that this was a time of militant and still crusading Christianity. The rise of the Muslim Ottoman Empire had interfered with European trade in Oriental spices and silks. And in 1453, just 2 years before that bull, the Ottomans had captured Constantinople, completing their conquest of the Christian Byzantine Empire. 40 years later, Columbus landed in the Caribbean, and Pope Alexander issued the papal bull Inter Caetera, dividing the newly discovered lands between the kings of Spain and of Portugal by drawing a north-south dividing line on the globe. The greater goal stated for these various grants was to bring the indigenous inhabitants of those lands to salvation through Christ. Excluded from this allocation were lands already discovered by other Christian princes. That in turn unleashed claims by England, France, and other nations to the possession of lands of which they claimed to be the first discoverers. And it's thus that claims of sovereignty by discovery were carried on into the legal systems of Canada and the USA. These papal bulls expressed many Eurocentric assumptions of that time, which had become systemically enshrined down to the present day, such as the concept of Terra Nullius. On the next slide, you will see a number of these axioms for Europeans. Terra Nullius. Euro-Americans often considered that lands that were actually owned, occupied, and being actively utilized by indigenous people to be vacant and available for discovery claims if they were not being properly used according to European and American law and culture. Then Christianity, under discovery, non-Christian people were not deemed to have the same rights to land sovereignty and self-determination as Christians. Civilization. Euro-Americans thought that God had directed them to bring civilized ways and education and religion to indigenous peoples, and often to exercise paternalism and guardianship powers over them. Only now are the wrongfulness of these assumptions beginning to be recognized in our modern society, due largely to the cultural and political resurgence and the work of indigenous people themselves. We're going to hear from them in a series of videos made for the Anglican Church of Canada.
The empires of England, Spain, France, and Portugal divided up the world, and they were very active in terms of exploring the world and taking our lands illegally that were already occupied by indigenous nations worldwide. So they went to the Pope of the Catholic Church to validate the illegal taking of the lands. And what did the Pope do in the 14th century? He issued a papal bull. The papal bull provided instructions that indigenous peoples are not human or Christian. Because indigenous people are not human, they don't have sovereignty in government.
I remember reading it and thinking, that doesn't make sense. How can you simply take over somebody's territory by saying you no longer exist or you never existed because we didn't know about you?
It wasn't until I was older and starting to educate myself on our history and what had happened and why our communities are in these states was when I heard the Doctrine of Discovery for the first time. So I just remember reading it and thinking, like, this can't be real. This isn't something that makes sense. This is something that's like inhumane and just not something that was fair to the people that were the protectors of this land.
Another word for this is Terra Nullius, empty land. And the land is made empty not by clearing the people out, but it's made empty through law.
Chief Justice John Marshall basically said, in simple terms, we are sovereign because of the Doctrine of Discovery. We have the right to govern this land because we discovered it. And he wasn't talking about we in the American sense, he was talking about we in the white man sense. And that therefore, those nations that were here, those Indian nations that were here, are now semi-sovereign nations. So they're no longer sovereign. They are dependent upon our sovereignty, our willingness to let them retain some elements of sovereignty.
It's relevant because not only is it basically the root of the whole structure of property law in Canada and the United States and Australia, for instance, but it is thoroughly enmeshed in the structures of our law so deeply that it's often difficult to even spot it.
This fiction, this hidden foundation still lives with us because we don't assume, by and large, that Indigenous peoples today are primitive or have lower social skills on this kind of hierarchy of civilizations. But nevertheless, the law continues to assume that sovereignty of the crown is paramount, that crown title is underlying all of our land, when in fact that comes from nowhere. It comes from just an assertion.
The underlying question is how, in the Canadian context, for instance, where does the Crown get its right to hold underlying title for all lands, which is the way that our law is structured? Where does the Crown get its jurisdiction over all matters? And there's this sense that this came out of the ether. It was always thus. Starting at the time of the first colonial incursions into the Americas, there had to be justification. Why did the colonial powers have the right to take over these lands and assert their sovereignty or their jurisdiction? What did they do about the fact that there were people here already who were living in, using these lands, exercising their own laws, having their own political structures? There had to be some sort of justification to allow that colonial authority to be asserted.
As Mary mentioned at the start, we're all learning here about the doctrine of discovery. We're not experts. And so we welcome your questions. And if we can't answer them, we will go and do our homework and find out the answers. This next section of today's presentation is entitled Legal Fiction. It explores what Canadian law is based on. Canadian law assumes that the underlying title to property and the authority to pass laws rests with the colonial crown, which does not recognize Indigenous sovereignty. It is referred to as a legal fiction, something believed for convenience sake. The video also explores the three branches of Canadian government. The judicial branch, the Supreme Court of Canada, has clearly said it recognizes the pre-existing rights of Aboriginal people to sovereignty. But the legislative branch, the lawmaking branch, and the executive branch, the Prime Minister and Cabinet, have not kept up with what the Supreme Court has clearly stated.
The Crown has not recognized Indigenous sovereignty. We still, by and large, have this Indian Act. The Indian Act was passed in 1876, designed to assimilate us. It's still the law today, and there's been very few amendments from that almost 150 years ago, 140 some odd years ago to this point. The Indian Act, the Crown has not recognized Indigenous sovereignty. We still, by and large, have this Indian Act. The Indian Act was passed in 1876, designed to assimilate us. It's still the law today, and there's been very few amendments from that almost 150 years ago, 140 some odd years ago to this point. The Indian Act is archaic. It's designed to make Indians into good Victorian citizens of kind of the 1870s. Its very purpose is to erase the presence of Indians through their attrition and then teach them how to be like good citizens of that once upon a time era.
The form of laws constructed for Indians today, based on those objectives of the Papal Bull, the Doctrine of Discovery, and those Empire of Canadian colonial policies, have resulted in systemic racism in the laws of Canada for Indians. I often laugh when they say, oh, we have Indian laws. No, there's Indian laws. Those aren't Indian laws. Those are laws made by Canada respecting Indians. It's not our law.
How do you take a whole population of people on a national scale and tell them that they have no right to make a decision? The idea was, we will make the decisions for you. We will make decisions about housing. We'll make decisions about economics. We will make decisions about your education. And if you have a decision to make, we'll make that decision for you too, right? You don't get to make any kind of decision without actually going through us. And the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs still has the authority to make those decisions, still has to resolve questions around bylaws. I have a will, I have a job, I have a car, 2 cars, I have a house. But if I die this week, the minister still has the power to change my will if she so desires. As of today, now.
Indigenous people are falling between the cracks of federalism. If we think we're trying to solve something, we ask the federal government to do it, and they try to apply their authorities, or we ask the provincial governments to do it, and they try to apply their authorities. But that's still other people making decisions for us as Indigenous peoples. What we need is some place where our authorities are recognized, and yes, we'll make mistakes, but we'll also then correct our mistakes like all other governments do. And if we don't correct them, right, there's going to be consequences for that. That needs to be a part of the way we think about our relationships.
We've won hundreds of Supreme Court decisions, and the latest one being the Williams decision, the Chilcotin decision. The Supreme Court said Aboriginal rights and title are recognized for like we've always said that. Now we have the highest court of Canada, Supreme Court of Canada, saying the same thing. We have the judicial branch of government, the legislative branch of government, and the executive branch of government. So you have the judicial branch of government clearly saying something that we've been saying for years, that Aboriginal rights and title are recognized. We've always had it. We have pre-existing rights as Indigenous peoples. We have the judicial branch saying that. If the legislative branch keeps up with that now, they have to get in line with what the judicial branch is saying. So I mean, all the laws have to keep up. The executive branch, the policies have to keep up. So if the legislative and the executive branch don't keep up with what the judicial branch is saying, you have a disconnect. So we have to really work hard and in partnership in a collaborative way with this government to fix all their illegal and racist laws and policies. And that's a lot of work, but it can get done. That will really be reconciliation in action when that happens.
What do we want our country to be built on? Do we want it to be built on this notion of others, people being inferior? Or can we build our country on the idea that we can agree and we can find ways to persuade one another? And I think that persuasion is more in line with our Canadian values.
Okay, this next video, this next section is entitled The Good Mind, and it looks at the reality of what Indigenous people's lives are like today and what needs to change. There's a huge gap between the overall quality of life for Indigenous Canadians versus the entire Canadian population. We've often heard about the water advisories and overcrowded living conditions, Indigenous children in care, Indigenous people overrepresented in our jails, conditions that are not the reality of most other Canadians. This section also examines the link between paternalism and racism and the reality that Indigenous people in Canada still live under the impact of the racist Indian Act, which was originally passed in 1876.
If you think that Indigenous people are a problem to be solved like poor people are a problem to be solved, some people think, or anybody else who's experiencing oppression are a problem to be solved, then there's a possibility that you're paternalistic at best. And paternalism and racism are on the same continuum, right? It starts off, and this is the story of Canada, it starts off as good intentions.
There are people that say, why should Indians be any different? Why should we treat them in accordance with these treaties or these special constitutional rights? Why don't they just get on with it? You know, my ancestors came here from England or Scotland or France or the Caribbean, and yes, the first generation was hard, but we've made it better for ourselves. Why don't they just do that? Which ignores the fact that we're being held down from doing that. It's true that we can leave our reserves and go to the cities, but all these structures of Terra Nullius travel with us.
They've taken a lot from us. A lot of our stories, we were an oral people. You know, they've practically almost taken our language, and you know, I'm really trying to learn Blackfoot from my grandparents, but there's a lot of work that we as Indigenous people have to do to ensure that we don't completely lose everything that makes us Indigenous, that makes us Nisitipi, that makes us whatever nation you come from.
I work with kids all the time. I got young people from this community that I watched, you know, going down because of drugs and alcohol, and said, okay, stop. I want you to do something different. I want you to come with me. I'm going to go to this conference, or I'm going to go to this event, and I want you to come and I want you to listen. I want you to listen to what Marie Sinclair has to say about history. I want you to listen to what I have to say about, you know, our communities and the impact that has been there because of things that you know nothing about, but you're going to learn. And I've watched those kids be successful because now they know something they didn't know.
One teaching that I really like is that the heart, something that I've come to realize is the heart has the capacity to collapse time. 20 years can go by after you've been hurt by a parent or an auntie, and boom, it collapses all that time. You feel the same way. So that speaks to the intelligence of the heart.
Indigenous communities have a lot of work to do as well to overcome their victimization. And so that entails healing, but it also entails overcoming anger.
As Indigenous people, we have to be the educators. We have to really profess the history as it happened and not try to cover it up anymore.
The doctrine of discovery has become an almost for some people it's almost an everyday language now, whereas before it was not. Nobody knew what it was, basically. And but nowadays there is some interest, some desire to know what it is about, even though it may not be favorable. But I think in order to have healing in our lives and reconciliation, we have to know what Doctrine of Discovery, what it is.
So why is the doctrine of discovery important to us today? While it has been repudiated around the world, the Supreme Court of Canada has grounded its interpretation of Section 35 of the Constitution on the dubious and racist legal principles that underlay the doctrine of discovery. The often used phrase, assertion of Crown sovereignty, is a Canadian euphemism for the doctrine of discovery. The continued centrality of the doctrine of discovery to modern Canadian Aboriginal law is the source of many Indigenous peoples' rejection of the Canadian legal system and government policies on reconciliation. And that particular quote is from Bruce McIvor's book. And
hi, I'm Cecilia, and I'm a member here at UCB, and I first became interested in helping out with this forum because I realized how little, if not nothing, I knew about the doctrine of discovery, and so it's been a real learning process for me. So this next section is about so where do we go from here? And it discusses moving towards a doctrine of reconciliation. So this is a quote from the Assembly of First Nations from a document called Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery in January 2018, in which it calls for a new paradigm to replace the doctrine of discovery. So the quote is, "It is essential to ensure a paradigm that is truthful about the history of past relations between First Nations and settlers. We must ensure a just process for resolution of outstanding issues of land rights, consistent with our right of self-determination. Such a framework is essential for advancing the reconciliation process between First Nations and non-Aboriginal Canadians. Everyone must recognize that Indigenous peoples in sovereign nations occupied the land before contact. Settlers are not expected to surrender occupation of lands they live on and return to their ancestral countries of origin. We're all here and we must live together." So we'll now show another short video in which Senator Marie Sinclair and others talk about the way forwards towards what they call a doctrine of reconciliation. It involves going beyond repudiation and defining the relationship between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples together.
I think a simple declaration of repudiation would be sufficient, but there are many who would question whether or not that would be far enough or go far enough. And within government, I think they wouldn't quite appreciate what the significance of that is, and because they don't know what the implications are, they resist the temptation to do it, or they resist the effort to do it. There are many within government who tread carefully when it comes to changing precedent. And so for that reason alone, just the fear of what it's going to do or what it's going to cause to them and how it's going to challenge Crown sovereignty, or undermine Crown sovereignty for that matter, is a I think it's a real question. It's a real open question.
We've come to expect that the land that we live on is ours, and that we should expect a kind of certainty in that. And I think that talking about things like repudiating the doctrine of discovery, it kind of unsettles that certainty that we've come to realize. But what I think is crucial for us is to understand that there really is another truth. And that truth is that we live on Indigenous lands, that we work on Indigenous lands. And that what we have to be about in the future is a recognition of that truth and then finding a way to move forward together in that truth.
Once you pull out the linchpin and open that door, then there are going to be all these implications that are going to follow.
In the calls to action, what we suggested, recognizing that that was going to be an area of resistance, what we suggested was, let's develop together a doctrine of reconciliation through a proclamation on reconciliation and a covenant on reconciliation, because regardless of what one thinks about repudiation and the implications of it, we can go further and redefine our new relationship through those documents as well.